You are listening to an exclusive interview on Bass Musician Magazine. The interview starts now.
Here we go. Hey everybody, this is Raul for Bass Musician Magazine, and today we have the great honor and pleasure of chatting with composer and bassist Andy West. For those of you that don't know Andy is the bassist with the Dixie Dregs, aka the Dregs. And he's done a whole lot of stuff since the 70s, and so we'll be kind of catching up. But starting from the beginning, Andy, tell us a little bit. How did you get started on bass?
First off, thank you for setting up this interview. I appreciate it. I've enjoyed your stuff a lot in the past, too, and learned a lot of interesting things. So we'll see if this isn't too boring. But, you know, as I recall, this goes so far back. When the Beatles were just starting up, my sister and I made fake guitars out of plywood and, wood with like magic markers and paint and stuff. And we made fake guitars and we would play like we were playing guitars. And so that was where that started. And that was probably when I was like 7 or something, or 8 maybe. Well, the Beatles were 63, so I could have been 10, as high as 10. Probably was, because I had to use a screwdriver to pound out the wood. Shortly after that, I convinced my parents to get me a guitar, and I started to learn guitar. I took a couple lessons. First song I ever learned was Walk, Don't Run, which is a great song. I still remember it. Then I started playing guitar and got into high school, and I think maybe some strings broke off my guitar, or I was jamming with people, making noise. Really, it's not jamming. It's just, making noise. And I essentially started playing bass, and then, probably I had a guitar for a year or two before I got a real bass, which was a Univox Beetle bass copy, which I wish I still had, but I don't. And that's where it started. So I'm completely self-taught from that point forward. Working through high school, we lived in Atlanta, and I had a lot of friends and musicians in Atlanta and had bands and stuff until I was, right when I was 17, I think I moved to, or right before I moved to Augusta when I was 16, right before I turned 17. And that's where I met Steve Morris, and we had bands in high school and then beyond. My first contact with formal education was Steve had decided that he wanted to go to music school. And so he went off to the University of Miami. And then he came back to Augusta and was telling me about everything. And I signed up for, he came back because he wanted to live in Augusta for another year for some reason, maybe his family or his girlfriend, I'm not sure. We both went to Augusta College together. And so, which was just a local community college, really. And I started learning music there. And that was a time when, okay, you're a breathing human being. They didn't test me for anything. I just kind of walked in and said, hey, music. And they were like, okay, and what instrument? And I'm like, well, I'd like to learn how to play cello or something, And so I started taking some cello lessons and music theory, but it was all very, very basic. But because of my kind of exposure maybe with Steve and, playing bass for a number of years and everything else, I kind of took to it pretty well. And so I was able to actually get into a real school when Steve went back to the University of Miami. I went back there. And actually, no, what I did was first I went to Atlanta for a year. The timeline is very hazy from back then. But so I had some college exposure to music, both in a normal kind of classical kind of music theory perspective, and then also at the University of Miami with the jazz curriculum that they had there, which I had previously had no exposure to. But I didn't actually finish college. I dropped out because through a combination of circumstances, even though I was a grade ahead of Steve, I ended up being a grade behind him in terms of graduating, and kind of like was, well, okay, I just want to play in the band or a band. And so that was that. So the rest of it's been self-taught. I've maintained a lot of interest in music, a lot of interest in music theory. The opportunities now are so great for learning. And even at this ripe old age, I can go on YouTube and watch a video by, Ben Levin or Adam Neely or any number of millions of guys, right, that are great. And that will give you insight and things, any one of these things are just, it's almost like, too much because, any one of them can lead you off in months of study if you want to. But, I like it. I'm still pursuing it, and that's the path. Now, as a bassist, because the Dregs was so it was really everything to me from high school through college and then beyond. I became kind of I don't want to say one trick pony, but I'm going to say it. I sort of was tuned to being the bassist in that band. And I would never consider myself a journeyman musician, someone who was well schooled in all aspects of music and could just go sit in at gigs. But I developed a lot of skill in the kind of music that we played, and I was very sensitive to it. And, that led me off into my own direction kind of in the future past when the Dregs broke up. So I guess that's the nutshell story, probably longer than I wanted to speak it. But
when I'm looking at Dixie Dregs, they kind of fall under prog rock, and prog rock is kind of a fascinating ongoing bracket, if you will, because depending where you are in time, it is being kind of progressive. And at a time when you had Beatles music, which has a whole lot more complexity and nuances than I think a lot of people will give it credit for, but at also a time in the late 60s and 70s where so much of rock was kind of your three-chord deals, the music that you guys were putting together was so much more complex and evolved. As I listened to the arrangements and, having a violin. I mean, who would have thought about having a violin in rock? Now, again, fiddling from the South, yeah, you kind of get it. But you weren't necessarily a Southern rock band. So right. It kind of evolved in a level of complexity to the point of being almost like it's classical in its complexities. And you listen to it, you go, oh my gosh, So tell us a little bit about that peg where the band was and with that kind of music. Do you consider it prog rock?
Well, first off, there's prog rock is it's like saying rock. Is Kiss the same as AC/DC? I don't think so. No. I'm not going to even put a value judgment on one or the other. I'm just saying that they're very different, but they're both rock. So prog is a very, I don't mind being associated with it because I personally like a lot of that music too. And certainly we have associations with that kind of thing. But, it's unlikely you'd find a prog rock band. Well, let me ask you this, would you consider Brad Paisley or Johnny Hyland or Albert Lee prog? Or even Bela Fleck, somebody like that. I would say no, you wouldn't think of them as prog rock, but they are certainly progressive in terms of the evolution of music. So I do think that we fall into the progressive in terms of evolution of music, and it's really Steve's compositional style combined with perhaps the execution that the rest of us kind of contributed to in terms of, the overall feeling of the band. But the compositions that Steve writes that I love the most are the ones that kind of exhibit all of that complexity you're talking about. All of that melody and melodic sense is one of his strongest things. He doesn't use often very dense, thick jazz voicings, for example, which I also love, but he doesn't do that. He stacks triads or has very kind of interesting harmonies. They're complex in the way that they are not necessarily traditional, but they also kind of hit your ear in a different way. Steve's music to me is always, there's always some undercurrent of positive energy in it. I don't know how else to say it. Even in the more heavy stuff that we did, there was always this kind of thing. So trying to talk about music is also tough in a lot of ways.
I hear you. And as a composer yourself, how did the composition of Dixie Dregs music go? Did everybody kind of bring their part?
I started writing music around the same time as Steve did, but not with the facility that he had. I mean, all of us in the band at that time wrote music, but none of us wrote music that was so cogent and identifiable as a thing as Steve's music, nor was it, his music was always so challenging, and it took up all of our energy, which was the appropriate. I mean, it was great, because we had an identity that was based around that. And none of us really felt the need to inject a lot of, hey, we got to do my song, kind of thing, right? There was really none of that. So really more what we brought was, does that sound good to us? Hey, do you really like that part? And Steve's a very sensitive guy. He would respond to that, and he had his own sensibility. I mean, basically he would never ask us to play something that we all didn't like. Even if he had it in him, I mean, it wouldn't come out, so that was it. And thinking back on it, I think really, and even with now what we're doing with this tour, it's not so much about the pure notes. There's also kind of this other thing, which you can believe it or not, it has to do with the character of the people playing it and the personalities and what they bring to it emotionally, and mm-hmm. I heard Steve Vai say something. I can't believe I've never heard anyone say this before, but I heard Steve Vai say it, where he said, every note is like a snowflake because it's unique. Even if you play exactly the same note, it's not going to be the same. On the same guitar, blah, blah, blah. You play at different times, everything's going to be slightly different, and I believe that. So that means that the people are bringing something else into it at that time. So that's what we brought in. We brought in that extra thing, whatever it was. I mean, Steve could we could all walk into Berkeley tomorrow and find 5 guys who could play this stuff from a measurable perspective better than any of us. Right? Measurable in the sense that, are the notes right? Is the timing right? Is it smooth? Is it blah, 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 blah? But it wouldn't be the same, right? I mean, it might be better or worse. I don't know. I'm going to presume that it wouldn't be as good. Mm-hmm. But, it might be. But it would be different for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, and interestingly enough, as a progression, the band had, it was heydays from 1970 basically until about, 1983?
Yeah, so the era of the band that I participated in, which was from high school when I met Steve, I mean, I was looking through my stuff, and I don't have a lot of memorabilia, but I do have one thing that I remember, a flyer we did in July of 1973, which was the first time it ever said Dixie Dregs. So before that, we had another band. So from 73 until 82, when Industry Standard which was our 6th album, was released, that was the era that I was, full-time in the band. And that's the era that we're drawing from for this particular thing. There was some time after that in the next 20 years when, different players got it. Dave LaRue, who I'm sure you probably know. I don't know if you've ever interviewed Dave. Yeah, Dave is great. I mean, he's an amazing musician, amongst other things. But, he was in the Steve Morse band. And so he was also in a version of the Dregs that was on 2 albums subsequent to that. But it wasn't really the concentrated time from, let's say, college through the 6th album was all about the Dregs. That was it. So that's where we're drawing from.
That ties in with the fact that after 40 years, the band is getting back together to tour, and the founding members.
Right. So, it's funny. I really wanted to say, plain and simply, it's the 40th anniversary of Free Fall in 2017, which was our first album. Doing any kind of thing like this, there are dozens of people involved, it turns out. So it becomes this 40 years, reunited thing. And it is true. It's been 40 years since this particular group, this version of the band with these 5 guys has played together. Mm-hmm. And so there is truth in it, but I don't want it to make it seem like no one has heard the Dregs in 40 years. That's not the truth. So this is the same band that was beating around the South, playing in bars, lugging our own stuff around, sleeping on floors, sleeping wherever we could, just trying to make it. I remember very clearly when we played in Macon, Georgia, and Phil Walden came in and heard us. And then the next day, our manager came back and said, they want to do a record deal, and it's like, oh my God, really? It's really going to happen? We had a couple of false offers before that were just crazy. But that was the time, and that is the band. So it's a very cool thing for us to kind of pull back into that.
I know that the tour starts on February 28th. I was looking at some tour dates, but if people want to know specifically, DixieDregs.com would be the best place to look. Perfect. I would be remiss. I don't want to forget. We need to talk about how you get your voice, particularly. And, of course, this appeals to all the bass gear maniacs. Tell us a little bit about your gear.
Okay, so I've always been a fan of high fidelity bass. My soundbite of the bygone era was I was driving a $200 Volkswagen, but I had a $2,000 bass, the Alembic. You know, and I started, I got an Alembic. It was a 76, I think, made in 76. So I got the Alembic, you know, a little bit before we did our album. And I really love that sound. And I always loved I always used low, like, you know, a biamp system with power amps and crossovers and all this stuff, even way back. You know, I mean, I remember this. This goes so far back. It's like I was looking at a catalog in a music store in Augusta. And I didn't know what I was looking at. All I knew was there were these big cabinets that had an 18-inch speaker in them made by Cerwin-Vega. There were big fold and hoard cabinets, you know, made for a PA. And I was like, I want those. I'm going to get 2 of those. And I got 2 of those, and then I stuck some 12s on top. And, you know, so it started there, and through the years it's gone on. Like anybody, I mean, there's so many tones in bass that are just great. But I've kind of come to own it, that I have a sound that I like. That's just what I like, you know. It's kind of like if you're Billy Sheehan, you sound like he does, you know, and he loves it. And, you know, sometimes I listen to him and I'm like, man, I'd love to, you know, there are very few occasions where you can hear what he's doing when it's not distorted. You know, he has his sound, right? Yeah. And I'm like, man, I love that. I really want to hear that. So, but I also love what he does otherwise. So for me, people probably go, wow, I'd really like to hear that like fat Fender tone, you know. But I'm like, no, you know, what I like is I like a deep tone, but I like a lot of mid, a lot of highs. I like it to cut. I use a pick. It's just for a reason. I mean, that's what I like. So that's where I'm at. And this tour I'm using, you know, of late, there's been a lot of evolution into this full range, flat response kind of notion. And I'm going there all the way. I've got an EV rig, which is really like a mini PA, but it's full range. I mean, it's just pure. You know, it sounds great. 15-inch sub, 12-inch, you know, cabs on top with a horn, and it sounds exactly like I want it to. And it's loud and it's clear, and you know, that kind of thing.
You're playing on 6 strings too, aren't you? So you're kind of in the extended range bracket.
Yeah. So about 1985, I moved to San Francisco, to the Bay Area, and I met Jeff Gould there, who was the founder of Modulus Graphite. And Jeff and I became friends, and I loved, you know, I played a Steinberger, and I thought graphite was a great idea, you know, and they made great basses even back then. So Jeff loaned me one day. He said, here, take this home and try it. And it was a 6-string bass. Really tight spacing. I was like, okay, this is weird. And I was playing it. I'm like, this is weird. But then I started to really like it, you know, and I was like, oh, this is incredible. And eventually I had him make me, we were talking about this over a couple of NAMMs, and but I really like the headless basses, you know, and so we were talking, and this was back in the day when, you know, you could pull different people together. So there was a company, Aria, that made basses, and they were interested in doing something with me. And I said, well, how about if we make a headless bass with a graphite neck and you guys, you know, market it? And they're like, yeah, okay. And this went on for about 1.5 years, and I ended up with 2 basses out of it. One is a fretless and one is a fretted. And I also wanted a whammy bar on them, so I got both with whammy bars on them. And they're great basses, but the deal didn't ever work out. And, you know, I just ended up keeping that bass. I evolved into 5-string because 5 strings were everywhere, and I realized that, you know, the low, having those extra low notes is very useful. It doesn't get in the way for me. Everything else is just there. 6-string is actually a different kind of animal, but I played it so many years now, and I guess I now have 5 6-strings, which is weird. But the ones that I'm playing are made by Jeff, and I just had to make me a new one. What happened with the Dregs was I started relearning the songs, and I didn't want to learn them I didn't want to replay them on a 35-inch scale bass. It was, some of the songs are really hard, you know, and a lot of big stretches and things. I've got short fingers, so, you know, I've learned how to adapt and roll my hands and stuff, but, you know, I haven't been playing a lot of very extremely fast music, and some of this stuff is. So I started on the 34-inch scale. I picked up my old 6-string about, you know, 7 months ago, and really started in earnest learning these songs. And I was like, I got to play this, you know, but I don't want to play this old bass because there's some funky aspects to it. And, you know, so I had Jeff make me a new one.
Very
so
cool.
It's got tight spacing. I said, well, how about we do something simple? Like, I'd love to have a headless bass, but I know that's going to be a big deal. It'll probably take us a year to pull that off. Let's just take your 5-string neck and put a 6-string on it and see how that goes. And it's great.
Very nice. And since you're mentioning strings, do you have a preference in strings?
Yeah, I use labella and I use the Super Steps. And the Super Steps, I was introduced to them in the early 90s when I had an F bass, which is another great bass manufacturer. I love F basses, but I had one for a couple of years, and it came with the Super Steps on it, and I was like, man, these strings are just incredible. So since then, I've been using those forever, and I still do. And they make a bunch of strings. I mean, I have some of these copper wound, they're copper tape wound strings that I have on another fretless bass that I have. They're just like, you know, really smooth, and they sound really good, but they're not like super growly. They're more like just smooth. You know, strings are another endless kind of rabbit hole, I guess.
They totally. Well, and the thing is, once you find something that feels right and works for you, a lot of times, you know, why keep looking? You know, you've got what's going right for you. Coming back to the band tour, you guys have got about 3 months of touring?
It's actually, I think there's close to 40 dates in 2 segments. And so we're doing one segment which starts in Florida and ends in Chicago. And then we're doing a second segment which, interestingly enough, starts in Milwaukee and then ends back in Atlanta. But the Milwaukee-Atlanta things are kind of a way for us to get out west, which... You know, you would think if you're going to go out west, you would start out west, but no, we're going to start in Milwaukee. It's over 2 months. It'll take place over 2 months. It's mostly in the month of March, and then the second leg is in April.
Gotcha. I know you guys have touring plans. Any additional plans for the Dixie Dregs?
The short answer is no. The longer answer is, you know, who knows, right? I mean, sure. I feel like there's a part of me that's just so grateful to have this opportunity to do this now and with these guys, and we're all, you know, still great friends, and we like each other, at least now before the tour anyways. No, that's more of a joke than anything. I mean, you know, the fact that we're all kind of in really basically good places in our lives is also one of those kind of miraculous things. When you get to this age and you start to look around and you see who's not around anymore, or you see people that are having a lot of problems. I mean, you know, it's everywhere, right? So we're all very grateful and very happy to be doing this.
With the band stopping in 1983, you have a life that went past that, and of course you've been involved with music throughout the whole time as part of the journey. Do you have any additional projects or things that you are working on?
Yeah. So, you know, here's the thing. I had kind of, before this came up, I had sort of resolved myself in a good way to being mini iconic figure to some people as part of this older band, you know, which a lot of people really appreciate still, thankfully. And just sort of doing what I do, you know, which is I love to play, I love to write, I work at the computer. I have a couple projects I was started before this came up with a friend of mine in Boston named Craig Pallett, and I'm very anxious to finish this. We're like about 3/4 of the way through it. When this came up, I was like, I was trying to do both, and I'm like, man, I gotta have single focus on this because there's just too much here. You know, so we kind of put that on ice until after this is over. And the same thing with another friend of mine, a guy named Dean Peer, who's a bassist. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He's another just great bassist and really good guy. We're just doing 2 bass things kind of, and we'll see how that works out. But, you know, it could be anything. I mean, I'm not going to quit playing music as far as I know.
Well, and if people want to know what you particularly are doing, you have a website as well, andywest.com?
That's right. If anything new is going on, I'll put it up there. Also, the Facebook seems to be pretty popular. Yeah. I mean, you know, people use Facebook. Fits and spurts for me on Facebook. I can only take it so long, but I do like the aspect of being able to just say, here's something in case anyone's interested.
Among the highlights and, of course, the good things is the immediate ability to reach and get stuff out, and sometimes find people that you didn't even know where they were. They'll come to the surface, bubble to the surface on Facebook. So it has its months. Well, Andy, we appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule. I know you're gearing up to get ready to go on this tour. Folks, if you want to catch the Dixie Dregs on tour, go to dixiedregs.com. If you want to know what Andy's projects he's got going, and of course I'm sure all of these ties over as well, andywest.com. Great conversation. So good to get a chance to chat with you, Andy. People, you've seen it here. Andy West coming to you live on Bass Musician Magazine.
Thanks for bassing out with us here on bassmusicianmagazine.com.